topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of our show, Mindfulness in Action, where I reflect with my friends, with colleagues, on what it means to really bring mindfulness into a living space. Often we are looking at mindfulness as a practice where we are sitting on the cushion and meditating. But mindfulness really has so much more than that. And I am today having a dear friend as a guest, as a co-partner in our talk on how do we really bring mindfulness when in places where trauma is present. And in a minute, you're going to meet Janine Kirby. As I mentioned, she's a friend, but I will also introduce her professional side. So she's a chairperson of the Institute of Mindfulness South Africa, IMISA, also board member of St. Bernard's Hospice, executive committee member of South African Society of Integrative Medicine, and board member of EAMBA. And we met through EAMBA, Earth Alliance of Mindfulness-Based Associations. And now we can create the space of all that professional part to be put on the side. And I would just like to welcome Janine as a friend, and maybe also ask her how would she like to introduce herself. Is there anything else, Janine, you would like to add?
Hi, Dalida. It's always a delight to be with you and to be talking to you. Even though Dalida and I haven't known each other for that long, I think we have a very deep connection. And I think sometimes why I said to Dalida to rather introduce me as a friend is that it's very easy to get caught up in our external identities and the things which we do. But I think that the way that we truly connect with other people is not from the doing side and not from the identity side, but rather person to person. And so I'm just a fellow person on this journey of life, here to learn, here to make mistakes, here to serve, here to be present with you.
Thank you so much. I remember maybe it was the first time when we met, or although maybe I met you first, in your doing mode, you were in the festival that IMISA has organized with EAMBA last year. But then when we had the first personal encounter, you just simply said, I think we might be really good friends through the work that we are doing. And it's been like that, really. It totally resonates what you shared. I also know in some of the programs that I do, there's this way when we introduce ourselves, and the first question would be, who are you? And then the second question, again, who are you? And the third one is, who are you really? And it's really about shedding all that identity. And we live in a world where that is, I guess, very much needed. But today, I would really like to bring some of your identities in the space so that those who are listening can also benefit from your experience, living experience, as a professional, but also just as through your cultural identity. So you live in South Africa, and through some conversations we had, I've been noticing this increasing curiosity on what it means to be living in a place where trauma is present, the history of trauma. And maybe that's something that we share as well, because I live in Serbia and there was war here, but it's somehow the complexity of where you're at is really something that I would like to bring to life in our conversation. And then, of course, you as a person, as a friend, as someone who is engaged with all that social weaving, as the festival was also sharing. So how does one start conversation about collective trauma?
I think that you start the conversation by the recognition of it. So I think that all of us live in spaces where there's collective trauma. I think there are very few spaces in the world where there isn't. And I hesitate to call it a gift, but one of the things about South Africa is that the collective trauma is very overt. It's very present. And so, there were, a lot of wars from the 1600s in South Africa. It was a fight over the land because it was a halfway spot for the trading vessels going between Europe and the East. But then we're extremely rich in minerals and resources. And so then it became, a war again with the colonial powers. And then after that, we've had the very painful history of apartheid, which ended in 1994. And so our history is overt, it's in our faces. The racism was really very overt, and how you were, what you had access to was predicated on the color of your skin. And certainly for the first 30 years of my life, I grew up in a space where, because of the color of my skin, I was enormously privileged. I was very privileged in that I had an excellent education. I had access to world-class healthcare. I was allowed to go to and to live in all the best spaces. And I was seen, in terms of the laws, as somehow better than, which is quite an uncomfortable space to be in lots of ways, especially when, it obviously makes no sense. So I think that one of, when you say this thing about collective trauma, is that we know it. We're in it every day. It's present. In other countries, I think that there is collective trauma, but it's just a little bit more hidden. Whereas for us, it's there and it's present. And so when something is present, it's so much, once we recognize that it's present, we then are able to be present to it. We're able to show up for it in ways that are much more difficult if we don't recognize it.
So I want to be a little bit cautious and not go straight into that conversation of how it's present in the daily life. It's something that you mentioned about that privilege, the just by your appearance being privileged. And I lived in China for 30 years, and in a way, I went there in early 90s, and there was a strong memory of poverty and cultural revolution still, and it was just a year after Tiananmen as well. And So I think for about 20 years, I had that feeling of walking on the street and being seen as different and being seen as immediately as someone who would have money, good education, and was very privileged. But I was coming from Yugoslavia, from the country where there is war and the whole country was collapsing. I came to China with really minimal. I had $300. Did really struggle to have my ends meet. But somehow the way that I was perceived pushed me to go and act in a way, to claim that privilege, right? To belong to that that group that the collective actually thought that I belonged to. It was a really strange experience. And then at certain point when China started to develop really a lot, that was shattered. Suddenly it was about the Chinese people being really rich, realizing that being, the fair skin, light skin doesn't mean much, and the situation changed. There was a lot of confusion from expatriate community when we were experiencing that. And of course, there's racism for people of color. What's politically correct to say? How do you say it in South Africa?
In South Africa, we just say black or white, or we use the word colored, which I know in the US is not a good word to use.
Yeah.
But in South Africa, colored people are just mixed race. Unfortunately, in South Africa, when I grew up, everybody was designated a race, and there are lots of people who kind of in between. Your mother's Indian, your father's colored. I mean, who are you? But we have to designate. We have to say who we are, and that has remained. And so the color of one's skin now is, as you say, what happened in China, is that we are prejudiced, while we're biased against. Obviously it's because of the redress of past wrongs, is that black-skinned people are given jobs ahead of white-skinned people, or a black economic empowerment. But it does still mean that anything you do, you have to actually, say what race you are, which is
so it's really present.
It's very present, yeah.
And if we go into the embodied experience of that, like in mindfulness practice, could you share, like, I mean, as something is coming, like potentially guilt, shame. I know you mentioned that a couple of times when we talked. What is how does one meet with that?
I think it's one of those things where many things can be present simultaneously, and so there is guilt and there is shame, and there certainly was more pre-94. Every now and then, when we have a World Cup or with Nelson Mandela, we feel a lot of pride. I think a lot of the time we can feel less than because of our history. But at the same time, there's also a sense of us all just getting on and doing what we need to do. and being friends. And so it's complicated, as you said before. It's complex. I think it's important to recognize the complexity of it rather than to just label it in simplistic terms.
And for those who might be listening and actually not even having an idea what apartheid, or probably heard of Nelson Mandela, it is such a strong figure. But in few sentences, if it is possible to mention that, just to give a bit more of context, could you share?
About Nelson Mandela?
Well, apartheid and how was that turn? Like how with him coming in, how was that change for the collective happening?
So apartheid was a systematic form of government where people with black skins were made to be less than and were less privileged, whereas somehow having a white skin just gave you privilege simply by the color of your skin. And it became increasingly untenable. It became increasingly violent. There were lots of protests, people in detention without trial, until in 1994, Nelson Mandela, who was a lawyer and he'd been imprisoned for 27 years for his beliefs, was released from prison, and he was elected as our first democratic president. And after having been imprisoned and made to work with manual labor for so long, I think it would be fair to assume that somebody would come out angry and bitter. But he emerged almost as if he'd been on a 27-year retreat, with such a sense of internal power and integrity, and did a number of things which just completely turned things on its head. So, as an example, Hendrik Verwoerd was one of the architects of apartheid. And when Nelson Mandela was released, he had tea with Betsy Verwoerd, Hendrik Verwoerd's widow, and sat down with her and drank together in a way which was just extraordinary, because it showed it wasn't a stance of weakness, it was a stance of such immense internal power. I never had the privilege of meeting him, but know a number of people who did, and they just said there was that sense of being in the room with somebody who was great. And that him, together with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, formed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where it was decided that it was just too complicated to somehow redress the past with punitive action, and so that there was this commission where people were invited to come and speak of the traumas that they'd endured, and the perpetrators were invited to come to ask for forgiveness from the people that they had harmed. And if the perpetrators fully disclosed what they had done, they were actually given amnesty. But if they hadn't, they didn't fully disclose, they were actually given some sentencing for the harm they'd done. And there was something about that, this presencing that was very powerful. Obviously, there are detractors who say that that the injustices weren't repaired, and that more should have been done. But still, there's extraordinarily powerful stories that came out of that commission, and stories of just connection and humanness.
That reconciliation, it's such a powerful work, and I'm just connecting with the awareness of how vision of an individual can impact the whole nation and the whole humanity as well. I don't know how much I want to go into that direction, but it seems to me that that kind of leadership is not really currently. We don't have that role modeling so strongly present. Some leadership that brings hope, reconciliation, healing. On contrary, there seems that there's a lot of rupture and constant tension. And then within all of that, we are asked to practice mindfulness, to soothe, to be non-reactive, and so on. How does that, in a place where there is such strong history of trauma, presence, being present as well, because the whole racial topic, it's such a complex. It goes immediately on the visual level, right? So in this, when we talk about the global collective, where there is that constant tension, how is it in South Africa at the moment?
Well, I think that, politically, politicians get cheap points from othering. I think it's really easy, from the way in which the brain is designed, is to quickly go into fear and into fear-based ways of thinking. And it's really easy to go into tribal ways of thinking. And it's easy to stir people up in those ways. And we see that globally. And especially with the lack of nuance and, social media, short sound bites, it's just really easy. So we see that in the US as somehow all the bad people are them, and they're the immigrants, and they have done something. Somehow that if they weren't around, then you would be safer and better. And so similarly, I think that's true in South Africa. We have tribal politics. We have politics of race still. But it is also true of South Africa that we are just really friendly. We get on well with each other. We like being with each other. I mean, if you came to South Africa, you'd find that it takes a long time to ask somebody where the jam is in a supermarket shelf, because you first have to greet the person and ask them how they are, and then how they're doing today, and how did they get there today, and are they feeling tired, and then you say, where's the jam? And so similarly, even while you're standing in the queue at the supermarket, you speak to the person in front, you speak to the person behind, you speak about why they're buying the different items. It's just that we are also very friendly, and very connected.
You're mentioning the word that is, it's really having such a potent and holistic meaning, and I'd like us to dive a little bit deeper into that. So tell us about Ubuntu.
So I'm always a little bit wary about speaking about it because I'm a white-skinned South African, and I don't really feel as if I have, I can speak about it in the same way as if I were a black-skinned South African, or black-bodied rather. But Ubuntu is really this sense that we are human only because you see me. So that if I weren't in relationship with you and you weren't seeing me and seeing who I am, and I wasn't seeing you and seeing who you are, we would lose all connection of relationality and to no longer be human. And so our humanness is really because of our connection and our relationality.
So what is different? What would be different if you were a black-bodied South African?
Oh, I can't say because I'm not. But
in your understanding at the moment,
yeah,
it's yeah.
I think that a Western way of looking at it, and I think that maybe as a white-bodied South African, I'm somewhere in between. But a Western perspective is really about I and my, and this is my choice, and I am going to do this, and I deserve this, and it's really is really around the sense of the individual, which has both good and bad aspects to it. Whereas my black-bodied colleagues really struggle with that idea of I and what is the self, because there's only a sense of myself in relation to others, a collective sense. And so there's only a sense of we, and sort of struggle with the idea of excelling, going ahead of everybody else, doing better than everybody else, because as soon as you do well, you actually have to bring the whole community with you. And so our young black professionals are under a lot of pressure because they are having to buy their parents' houses, they're having to send their cousins to university, they're having to look after their grannies and aunties and uncles. And in the black community, you would think of your aunts and your uncles as your mothers and fathers, and your cousins as your brothers and sisters. So you'd say it's my cousin brother or my cousin sister, and would have the same sense of responsibility to them as we would in a much smaller nuclear family. So there's this kind of this interplay all the time between the individual and the collective.
And in a professional setting where there's more priority to, let's say, have more black-bodied professionals, in a way, as you mentioned at the beginning, is there anything that this attitude of Ubuntu, of we as the main concept, that is actually shaping the way how corporations or any working place is functioning?
Yeah, I think that our young professionals, and they often are young because they're the ones who've had the opportunities that their parents didn't have, subconsciously are struggling all the time with this idea of the collective versus the individual. And so, on the one side, they're needing to look after everybody, but on the other side, they want to buy themselves a car and a nice pair of shoes. So I just, I think it's a tension. But I think it's also part of a bigger tension that we should all be struggling with. That all the time we should be looking at what is that I want, as opposed to what is good for everybody. So when we're making decisions about climate choice, or we're making decisions about where we buy our food, or we're making decisions about what clothing we wear, we actually all the time need to be also asking those questions. And I think that it's too easy to go into the individual I state. But like I work in like, for example, in hospice and in palliative care, and that just, I guess that sense of Ubuntu means that with the nursing team is that we really work as a team and as a whole, where we kind of helping each other out. We're seeing how we can support each other. We are we're sharing responsibilities and duties. It's very much a sense of the interrelationality.
All of this, my cat Joy just jumped into my lap. Maybe you noticed that I was getting a little bit confused. I could see him waiting to jump, and I know that he has these moments often when I'm entering a space of presence. He likes to sit in my lap and actually feel a little bit of that. And there was in the back of my mind, as you were sharing all about that context of South Africa, Ubuntu, the we, realizing how mindful all of that is. I mean, the whole research that is going on in the world of secular mindfulness, and of course the traditional practice as well. And there it is. It seems that it's part of the collective within the culture. I'm not hearing any much, or at least I'm not aware of any religious background of it. But that culturally, it's a very much concept of interbeing, of presence, of the interest of being sangha, working together, right? So what kind of practices would a family have to bring these concepts alive, so that it continues to bring those roots from Ubuntu into the present moment, into the future?
I'll come back to that. If I may just maybe circle back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and this idea of being truly present and mindful. And just, if I may just tell you a story that emerged from it, one of the stories. And so Pumla Madikizela Gobodo is one of the researchers and one of the people who sat on the commission. And so she told the story where they had somebody who was testifying at the commission, who they called Dr. Evil. He had really done enormous amounts of really bad things. And he was in prison because he hadn't confessed to everything, and so they'd imprisoned him. And the daughter of one of the people that he'd murdered wanted to speak to him. And so she arrived, and he came into the place where they were sitting, and apparently had this sort of jerk, and apparently he was quite disturbed by all of, in African traditional religion, you'd see that by the ancestors and the spirits around him. And so she had this list of questions like, she had an hour to be with him, how did you know about my mother? How did you get there? What was she wearing? Where did you come from? How did you kill her? What happened afterwards? So she had this whole list of questions that she really needed to find out. And as their time came to an end and she was trying to get to the end of a list of questions, they started speaking to each other faster and faster, and their heads got closer and closer, until she said, until we were breathing the same air. And so I think that is one of the things that we understand, is the sense that we're all breathing the same air. No matter what we have done, no matter how we've harmed, no matter how we have been harmed, there's the sense of that we're all breathing the same air. Yeah, it's a very powerful story.
Thank you for sharing that story. That is really, really touching. Yeah. So real.
When you're asking about families, or I guess it's quite a difficult question. It's a little bit like how in Western families do you have a sense of being an individual? I mean, I think there's just a sense in African families of it. It's just there isn't a sense of a nuclear family. Everybody's your mother, everyone's your auntie, everyone's your brother, everyone's your sister. A lot of children are raised by their grannies. And in fact, many grannies get really upset when the mothers say, "No, I want to look after my child. I want to raise my child." It's kind of like that's a very they get upset by that. It's like the child belongs to the family. It doesn't belong to the individual. I mean, similarly, even as a medical doctor, for us, when you go and you see the doctor, you go in individually, and it's like my illness, and I want to speak about my illness. But in an African traditional space, it's actually our illness. And you go in as a community to speak about our illness and what is happening in the illness. Even if you go and see a traditional healer, you would go and see the traditional healer, and the traditional healer then divines what is wrong with you. And then the family would say, we agree or we don't agree. But it's not an individual practice. It's a collective practice. Everything is a collective practice. And
can we pause here? Sorry, I feel like I need a little bit more to grasp this. It feels so far away from what I know. That going to see a doctor means, like, here it's you're going to a doctor. My parents, they're 86 and 83 years old, and they go to see a doctor, and I ask them afterwards, what did the doctor say? And it's like, well, we got medicine, like pills. And I said, what else? He's like, I don't know. It's like, it's the authority of the doctor, and the doctor decides how is one going to take care of their body. No questions asked. I a couple of times went with my mother, I asked questions, and the doctor was like, no asking questions right now. It's like full authority. And you feel like a little kid going and being like, I'm so sorry. And was like, I don't know what is going to be the consequences with me just wanting to ask a question and how to take better care of her. So can you backtrack a little bit more? So the what I heard is that the family goes together and they're inquiring on the health as we are ill, as
Well,
a family, or well,
it's
it's
this.
in the language, or mhm.
I mean, Granny is ill, but the illness isn't just Granny's.
Yeah,
So that
of course.
the illness is part of the whole family system. And so, people don't come in by themselves to see a doctor. You come in with your family. And you just need to
And
have enough seats for the family.
and in the conversation, is that addressed at all? How is the family suffering in the process of caregiving, caretaking?
In family medicine terms, we should be doing that in every consult. So that in family medicine terms, we always look at the personal, the clinical first, then the personal, and then the social, the collective. So that all of that should be looked at all the time. I guess that in a Western way, we would look more and say to you, how is that for you? And what is it that you're concerned about? And what are your fears and your questions? Whereas in Africa, you would first ask the family and say, how is that for you? And what are you needing? And actually, quite often, in Xhosa, which is the language locally where I stay, there isn't a word for depression.
Mm.
And if I ask somebody, how are you, they would say, well, my cousin's working. In other words, there's some income. And so even though there are maybe 15 of you living in a house and your poor cousin is the only one working, there's no kind of understanding of that personal stress, or no wording for it. Obviously, there's an experience of it.
Obviously, yeah, and as someone who is really bringing mindfulness to South Africa, even the wider region, you're collaborating with other countries as well. What does that mean in terms of mental health and mindfulness work?
I think the thing that I always found most curious when teaching mindfulness is people who are coming from a more Western perspective. At the beginning of the course would have lots of I and me language, and at the end be starting to think more broadly and more around we and interbeing. Whereas people who are coming from more African perspective would start off with the words of being, interbeing, and end up with some words around I, what I need to do to look after myself, in this sense of interbeing. And so I'm just always curious about this flow, finding some kind of balance between me and we. I don't think it's one or the other. I actually think it's both. And
Yeah.
I think it's important to be present to both. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember in some of our conversations of mentioning, the aspect of and the research that has been done on compassion and how important it is to have strong boundaries for people who are very compassionate, having strong boundaries. So I just wonder what happens with boundaries when there is only we, and how can we really take care of that self, and also that compassion without self-compassion is not really complete. At least that's what the research is saying, what we are understanding now, and it's such a fluid exchange between these concepts, and the question could be more, what can we learn from each other, and how can we again bring that together, and so that we can sit together and have conversation just like we are right now.
Yeah, I love that, Dalida. I mean, I love this idea of being in conversation with each other. I think one of the things which has been so lovely and profound for us as a South African community is that it feels like what we can offer from Africa is starting to become part of that international conversation. So I think before there was lots of understanding from an Eastern cultural understanding and from a Western perspective, but that actually Africa brings another perspective. And I think that the more we're in conversation with each other and the more we see that which is the same or similar, and that which is different, that we can add a different dimension and richness, I think the more, well, I guess the word is rich, the richer the weave, the more we can have a wider perspective, not a smaller perspective. Yeah, we can somehow weave it together.
And maybe we just have a couple of minutes left before we end the limited the time we have. I feel like for me personally, this is the beginning of conversation, of course, and I'm sure we are going to continue to talk. But just for today, from your experience, how does one, if there was, like maybe your contribution to whoever is listening to this conversation, either today or later, how does one sit with differences in reconciliation, or in just that capacity to embrace and see the otherness and not judge it, or try to change it?
I mean, I think you answered the question. We just sit with it, and that we do sit with it, that we turn toward it, we present with it, we're accepting of it. So it's so easy to push it away and to push away anything which is uncomfortable, which we don't want, and that just sit with it, to be with it, to be with other people. And just recognize how much we can learn from that relationship. I mean, I feel enormously privileged, not so much because of all the privilege I've got, because that is also true, but that I work so culturally. And so because of that, all the time it brings my own beliefs a little bit more into focus, and my own biases, my own unseen prejudices, obviously a little bit more to focus, but more so than if I were just within a monocultural society. It makes me question, makes me think, makes me reflect.
Yeah. It's certainly a practice, and I'm even feeling a touch of I don't know how would I name it. What is present? Closest I can come to is a bit of sadness. It seems that it's like a drop in the ocean of what really needs to be done in order to awaken that collective. And Thich Nhat Hanh was saying that maybe the next enlightened being is not going to be an individual, it's going to be the collective, really. And I honestly believe that is the direction where humanity is going, and trying to put a dent in the universe and maybe give a little little drop to whatever the ocean might be coming. as we are ending our time together for today, is there anything that you would like to share? And perhaps invitation for IMISA, for people to come and support whatever, how to find you if they would ever come to South Africa. What would be your message for the end?
Oh, well, our message is we are a welcoming community. We are doing some very innovative work in communities and in training our teachers, just in ways of being able to regulate in the midst of ongoing collective trauma, and any ways that people feel that they can contribute towards that. We're very appreciative of the help and assistance that we get from the wider community, because I guess all of us, we're just trying to make it better, whatever that means, in our own little ways, and not to sort of see the bigger picture, but just to see, and think, oh, what am I actually doing? But just to know in our small spheres of influence that we just want to make it like easier and better, have an intention of healing.
Thank you so much, Janine, for being here with me, with us, and bringing your life experience. It's been truly enriching. And for all of those who are listening, I invite you to do check the Institute for Mindfulness South Africa, IMISA, and see the work that they're doing. It's truly inspiring community. And also AMBA, Earth Alliance of Mindfulness-Based Associations, and there will be more. I mean, I'm inviting multitude of people who are so much involved in the world of mindfulness. And for tonight or today, this is Mindfulness in Action. My name is Dalida, and see you next time.